71 people died 11 miles from the runway, and the part that still haunts this story is that it wasn't just bad luck. Chapecoense were flying to the biggest match in club history. Still, before Medellin ever saw them, fuel, delay, and one late emergency call had already turned a final into a funeral. Then Brazil and Colombia answered with something so powerful it barely felt like sport anymore. This is the real story of the final that never began. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. The strangest thing about the Chapecoense tragedy is not only that a football team died on its way to glory, it is that, after the mountain kept the plane, a green shirt began to move through South America like a relic. Rivals saluted it, cities wore it, mothers held it against their chest as if cloth could carry the missing home. A first leg that never kicked off became a vigil with no whistle, and the question still hangs there in the dark: how did they fall so close to the runway? Because this was never supposed to be one match, one night, one neat 90-minute legend. It was supposed to be a two-legged final, the first chapter in Medellin, second leg in Curitiba, a small club writing itself into continental memory the old way, by surviving the noise and then daring to dream bigger. Instead, memory wrote the story first, and what it wrote was crueler than defeat, because defeat at least lets the team come home alive and argue about chances. To understand why this wound went so deep, you have to begin in Chapecó, in the west of Santa Catarina, where Chapecoense was founded on May 10, 1973, born from the union of two local clubs and from a simple hunger: bring professional football back to a city that felt forgotten by the larger map. It was not born as a giant. It was born as an answer to absence, which is often how the most stubborn stories begin. It won its first state title in 1977. It tasted Brazil's top division in the late 70s, disappeared into the long and unglamorous tunnels of the lower game, and then, after years of climbing, returned to the top flight in 2014. That is part of the ache here. Chapecoense was not one of those clubs built to inherit greatness. It had to climb back to the table by scraping mud off its boots, season after season, until the continent finally had to look at it. By 2016, the climb had become something almost too cinematic for modern football. Chapecoense reached the Copa Sudamericana final, the biggest match in its history, a small club from southern Brazil, now preparing to face Atlético Nacional in Medellín. In South America, these stories are never just sporting. They become family folklore before they are even finished. Uncles argue over them, taxi drivers repeat them, the city begins speaking through formation charts and prayers, and in Chapecó, you could already feel people walking a little taller. But wait, notice this, because it matters. The team was not simply boarding a plane in Brazil and heading cleanly to Colombia. Chapecoense had wanted Lamia for the entire trip from São Paulo to Medellin, but aviation rules did not allow that arrangement as the club had hoped. So the delegation flew first to Santa Cruz de la Sierra in Bolivia, and only there boarded Lamia Flight 2933 for the final stretch to Medellin. Even before the engines roared, the route already carried compromise inside it. The original plan also included a refueling stop in Cobija, near Bolivia's border with Brazil. That is the kind of detail nobody puts on the poster. Nobody makes chants about fuel stops, but history loves the dullest details, because the dull details are usually holding the knife. The departure from Santa Cruz ran late, and that lateness helped kill the Cobija stop. Suddenly, a routine pause for fuel became one of those roads not taken that later looks less like logistics and more like a door closing. From there, the story stops sounding romantic and starts sounding administrative, which is exactly why it becomes terrifying. The final report left very little room for myth. The flight was planned without the fuel margins needed for reserves, contingencies, or a diversion to another airport. In plain language, the aircraft was being asked to do a job with almost no mercy built into the plan. The danger was not born over the mountain. It boarded in Bolivia with everybody else quietly as paperwork. And no, the mountain did not ambush them with some supernatural hunger. There was no storm swallowing the plane whole, no apocalyptic weather scene, no curse hiding in the clouds. What the evidence shows is colder than that. The flight arrived near Medellin with margins so thin they were practically superstition. One unexpected delay, one extra loop, 1 minute too many, and the arithmetic would turn murderous. That is what makes this tragedy so unbearable. It did not need a monster. It only needed almost enough. Then came the traffic over Rio Negro. Another aircraft had been given priority due to its own emergency, and the Chapecoense flight was instructed to hold in a holding pattern. Circle, lose time, burn what little grace remained. In those final minutes, the jet made 2 loops while the airport sequence untangled itself below. From far away, that sounds procedural. Up close, it feels like listening to a door lock from the other side. The runway was there, the mountain was there, the fuel was not. The crew spoke of fuel problems, but the full emergency was declared far too late. The final report says the aircraft had been in a critical fuel state long before the explicit emergency call came. Then the engines began to die, one after another, in a sequence more terrible because it was so mechanical. No melodrama, no heroic last-second miracle, just a machine going silent, because the tanks had finally given up the last drops they did not truly have to spare. Shortly before 10 that night, between La Ceja and La Unión, the aircraft hit the ridge of Cerro Gordo, about 11 miles from the airport. There were 77 people on board. 71 died, 6 survived. Among the survivors were 3 players, Alan Ruschel, Jackson Folman, and Neto. Around them were coaches, staff, crew, and journalists. Because a team never travels alone. A club brings not only legs and tactics, but also voices, witnesses, and the people who help turn a match into meaning. And here is one of the cruelest details of all. Because the plane had exhausted its fuel, the crash did not erupt into the inferno people instinctively imagine. Investigators quickly found no evidence of fuel on board. The engines had flamed out before impact. So the violence arrived not as fire from cinema, but as mountain metal darkness and the blunt force of a silence that no prayer could outrun in time. Sometimes the most horrifying thing is not spectacle, it is the plainness of a failure that everyone should have prevented. That is why this story still unsettles people. We prefer grand villains, we prefer lightning, sabotage, divine signs, anything dramatic enough to match the pain. But the thing that killed this dream was smaller and uglier, thin margins, bad decisions, a skipped refueling stop, a late emergency, trusting luck a little too long. The mountain received only what human beings had already set in motion, and the land, as always, kept receipts. Back in Chapecó, the city understood before it fully understood. News moved the way bad news always moves in a smaller place, not by bulletin, but by faces changing in real time. Schools released students, factories stopped their machines, hotels filled with journalists, mourning was declared. The stadium became a center of waiting, receiving, and bracing for what nobody knows how to brace for, the return of people who were supposed to come home carrying excitement, not coffins. And then the green shirt changed meaning. Before it was ambition, a banner for underdogs climbing where they were not expected. After the crash, people wore it like a sacred mantle. Children wore it, older adults wore it. Men who had probably spent a lifetime swallowing tears wore it in public without shame. The same cloth that had once asked for victory now asked for endurance. In that city, the shirt was no longer just uniform. It was grief made visible, walking from house to house. Part of the reason the mourning cut so deeply was simple and profoundly human. In Chapecó, the club still formed part of the texture of daily life. This was not a distant corporate giant hidden behind tinted glass. Players, staff, and directors lived close enough to the town to be recognized in ordinary places. Supporters could touch the edges of the club's routine. They knew the voices, the habits, the errands, the smiles. So when the plane fell, the city did not feel it had lost celebrities. It felt it had lost neighbors. Arena Conda, built for chants and noise and small miracles on grass, became something else entirely, an open-air wake. Rain fell, coffins arrived. Families walked the same ground where goals had once been celebrated. Thousands of mourners were drenched as more than 50 caskets were brought into the stadium. A week earlier, the city had been preparing to celebrate the club's rise. Now the same turf had become a civic altar, because football in our part of the world is often where a community gathers. The team had failed to cross the sky and reached Medellín, where the first leg should have been played, but at the very hour football had promised drama, the city offered something rarer than spectacle. Atlético Nacional's stadium was no longer waiting for a final, it was waiting to become a vigil, and that is the moment this stopped being only a Brazilian tragedy and became one of those continental memories that feel almost too symbolic to be true, except that tens of thousands of witnesses were there. At Atanasio Girardot, the night was white. White shirts, white flowers, white candles. Nacional's players stood holding flowers at the center circle, while the stands filled with mourners. One report counted 45,000 inside the stadium. Another scene from that night has never quite left the continent. A football ground prepared for rivalry instead of receiving grief with the discipline of a cathedral. If Chapecó had turned its stadium into an altar, Medellín turned its own into a sanctuary for strangers. And then came the chant. Not abuse, not provocation, not the noise a visiting team is meant to hear. The people of Medellín answered tragedy by singing for Chapecoense. In Brazil, supporters watched a video of Colombian fans singing, urging the whole continent to hear it and for the champions to be remembered. Rivalry had been stripped of its job. For one night, football stopped asking who would win and started asking whether human beings could still be decent in public. The answer for once was yes. Candles were lit against the night. There were flowers in thousands of hands. There were doves released, one for each victim. There were giant screens declaring eternal champions. None of this brought anyone back. But ritual is not built to reverse death. Ritual is built to stop grief from scattering into formless panic. It gives pain a corridor to walk through. It tells the bereaved, and even the merely stunned, that memory will not be left to fend for itself in the dark. Then Atlético Nacional did something that sealed the moral memory of the whole event. Instead of defending technical rights in a final destroyed by disaster, the club asked that Chapecoense be awarded the title. There is something almost scandalously beautiful about that gesture, because sport is so often trained to worship the result. But some wounds are too large for the scoreboard. In that moment, Medellín understood that dignity mattered more than procedure, and history noticed. On December 5, 2016, the title became official. Chapecoense were declared champions of the Copa Sudamericana, and Atlético Nacional received the Centennial Fair Play Award for the gesture. Those are the formal words, but the deeper truth is less bureaucratic. A trophy that should have been contested on the field was instead transformed into a collective act of recognition, almost like a funerary honor granted by an entire continent. The cup still existed, its meaning had changed forever. That is why the final that was never played may still be one of the most remembered finals in South American football. No kickoff, no tactical battle, no desperate last-minute equalizer, and yet everybody remembers it, because what replaced the match was a public stripping away of vanity. For one suspended night, football returned to something ancient, a place where communities gather to grieve, sing, witness, and swear the dead will not be reduced to numbers. Now, this is where the story begins to feel almost religious, and we need to be careful with that word, not because it is false, but because it can be used lazily. The crash itself was not mystical. The cause was brutally human, but the response to it, in Chapecó and Medellín, drew on rituals, symbols, processions, songs, offerings, and shared acts of remembrance that looked very much like what people do when ordinary language collapses. And ordinary language absolutely collapsed after this. Many people in Chapecó turned toward faith and spiritual communities because grief had opened a hole too large for football language alone. In the Catholic cathedral, masses filled day after day during the arrival of the bodies, and after services, many people moved in procession toward the stadium, singing and praying. The parish was not an abstract institution in this story. According to later testimony, some players and staff had already been close to it before the crash. In mourning, that bond deepened. Evangelical churches responded in a similar spirit. Their doors stayed open. Extra services were held. Consolation became a schedule, not just a feeling. One pastor interviewed in the later research said that some members of the congregation had been on the flight, which meant the sorrow was not being observed from a safe distance. It was cutting directly through the pews. In moments like that, theology becomes less important than availability. Who stayed open? Who listened? Who refused to let the mourners sit alone? The Spiritist community offered another kind of shelter. Meetings were organized for families and residents trying to make sense of death, separation, and survival. One striking detail from the later testimonies is that many of the people who attended those gatherings had never before entered a Spiritist house. That matters. It tells you how grief behaves. Pain makes pilgrims out of people who, in calmer times, might never have crossed certain thresholds. Not because sorrow turns everyone credulous, but because absence makes every language of comfort suddenly worth hearing. The city itself also mobilized beyond any single church or doctrine. Religious leaders, psychologists, community groups, and local authorities were called to help families and residents endure the first unbearable days. In the accounts collected later, psychological assistance became part of the emergency response, as it should. A tragedy like this is not only a logistical crisis, it is an emotional landslide. Bodies must be identified, yes, but the living must also be taught how to breathe again. Even the club offices became a place of refuge. According to the later testimonies, Chapecoense opened its doors to families, supporters, psychologists, and the press. Employees who had lost colleagues still kept receiving people, helping organize, answering questions, and carrying out the dull labor that tragedy always demands. That detail matters more than it first appears. Catastrophe is not survived by ceremonies and headlines alone. It is also survived by exhausted staff members making coffee, opening rooms, guiding relatives, and refusing to collapse in public. So yes, the event acquired a sacred atmosphere, but we should not let sacred atmosphere blur accountability. There is a temptation, whenever a tragedy is wrapped in candles and hymns, to let the practical truth slip away in incense. We should resist that. Because if this story becomes only a legend, then the people responsible get to disappear behind the poetry, and that would be an insult, not an honor, to those who died on that hillside. No curse killed Chapecoense. No prophetic omen did it. No cosmic debt was being collected in the mountains of Antioquia. The final report pointed instead to fuel exhaustion, inadequate planning, poor decision-making, and a late emergency declaration. There was no fuel on board, and the aircraft had radioed that it was running out of fuel before impact. That is the hard center of the story, and it must stay there no matter how many candles we light around it. The report's language is dry, almost offensively dry considering what it describes, but dry language is sometimes the most merciless. It said the flight had not been planned with the fuel needed for an alternate airport reserves or contingencies. It said the engines shut down in sequence from fuel exhaustion. It said decision-making failed at the airline and in the cockpit. It said the emergency was declared too late, after precious time had already been spent in the holding pattern. That is not mythology. That is an indictment. And still, accountability and solidarity are not enemies. We can hold both at once. We can say the crash was preventable and still honor the beauty of what followed. We can say negligence killed people and still bow our heads before the decency Medellín showed Chapecó and the discipline with which Chapecó received its dead. In fact, that double vision is the honest one. Without truth, tribute becomes performance. Without tribute, truth becomes a spreadsheet. This story demands both. The football world understood that, at least for a moment. Across South America and beyond, clubs wore green, added Chapecoense symbols, and observed minutes of silence. The disaster broke out of local grief and became continental mourning. That matters because football often behaves like a market or a battlefield. Here, briefly, it behaved like a neighborhood. The same sport that spends most of its weekends teaching people how to hate a shirt was suddenly teaching them how to carry one with tenderness. The gestures did not stop with tears and applause. Brazil and Colombia later played a friendly fundraiser for the families of those who died. Money cannot redeem a mountain, but it can at least answer one of grief's cruelest practical jokes. The bills keep arriving after the funeral. So the game became a collection plate of sorts, a way for the wider football world to say that solidarity should not end when the television cameras finally get bored and move on. Months later, another scene added a different kind of weight to the story. Alan Ruschel, one of the surviving players, returned to the field in a friendly against Barcelona. Think about that for a second. The body that had escaped the mountain, broken and altered forever, walked back onto the grass under lights at Camp Nou. That was not a simple comeback. It was memory learning to move again in public, with every step carrying the names of people who should have been beside him. The survivors themselves became living archives of the crash. Alan Ruschel, Jackson Follman, who lost a leg, Neto, who carried his own heavy survival into the years after. Survival is often described like victory, but that is a comfortable lie told by people watching from the outside. Survival is not neat. It means waking up in a world that has kept you while taking others. It means being grateful and burdened at the same time, which is one of the hardest combinations a human being can carry. And the story found another cruel echo in March of 2019, when Rafael Henzel, the journalist who had survived the crash, died after a heart attack. He had become, for many people, a voice of continuity, one of the men carrying the memory of that night into ordinary time. His death did not reopen the wound, because the wound had never fully closed. It simply reminded everyone that survival itself can become part of the aftershock, another fragile thread in a story already woven from loss. Memory also entered the landscape. Memorials rose. The crash site near La Unión took on commemorative meaning. Chapecó and Medellín formalized the sister city bond in May of 2017, sealing in public life what grief had already sealed in feeling. That matters because history is not confined to books. It is kept in plazas, in annual ceremonies, in official friendships, in the places cities choose to name and preserve. so that the next generation will ask, sooner or later, why this corner still speaks with another city's accent. And through all of that, the green shirt kept returning. First it was hope, then it was mourning, then it became gratitude, crossing borders and appearing in the hands of rivals. Later, it became memory stitched into memorials, photographs, murals, and anniversaries. The object stayed the same. Its meaning kept deepening. That is how symbols work in the aftermath of disaster. They absorb what language cannot hold, and then they follow the living from the stadium back into the street. Another detail deserves respect here. After the crash, other Brazilian clubs offered players, and there were proposals to protect Chapecoense from relegation for years. Sympathy was wide, but Chapecoense chose the harder dignity of rebuilding properly, rather than living forever in an exception. That choice matters because grief can become a kind of glass case if people are not careful. To rebuild is to say we will honor the dead, but we will not turn them into a reason to stop living. That decision also reveals something about the club's soul. Chapecoense did not survive by pretending the old team could be magically restored. It survived by accepting that the future would be scarred and building anyway. Brick by brick, match by match, name by name, there is a kind of nobility in that which football rarely knows how to describe, because the sport prefers instant redemption arcs and miracle montages. Real rebuilding is slower than that. It limps, it doubts, it keeps going anyway. So when people say the Chapecoense tragedy became almost religious, I understand what they mean. They mean stadiums turned into shrines, chants into prayers, shirts into relics, processions into public liturgy, and rival fans into something like mourners at the same wake. They mean that death forced two cities to resort to symbolic language because literal language was insufficient. But the phrase only makes sense if we remember the ground beneath it. The crash was not a divine mystery. The response to it was a human ritual. And that brings us back to the question we began with. How did they fall so close to the runway? The first answer is brutally concrete. A compromised route, a lost refueling stop, dangerously thin fuel planning, a holding pattern near Medellín, and an emergency declared too late. That is the machinery of the disaster. The black boxes, the reports, and the records all point there. We do the dead no service by dressing that up as fate when it was, in essential part, preventable. The second answer is the one the streets gave. Why did it feel larger than a crash, larger even than sport? Because Chapecó and Medellín refused to process the dead as statistics. They wrapped them in songs, candles, flowers, prayers, public grief, white clothes, green shirts, and the stubborn insistence that memory must be shared or it curdles into something lonelier. In that sense, the most unforgettable part of the story was not only the fall, it was the answer people gave to the fall. That may be why the Chapecoense story still refuses to settle into the archive. It is not only about an aircraft running out of fuel over Antioquia. It is about what happens when a dream breaks in public and entire communities decide that decency, ritual, and solidarity will be the reply. The first leg never began, the final was never played, and yet its echo still fills stadiums of memory more completely than many cups that were actually won on the field. So here is the image I cannot shake. A green shirt in Brazil, a white candle in Colombia, and a mountain in between, holding the silence that linked them forever. That is the geography of this story. Hope, grief, distance, brotherhood, failure, memory. If you strip away the myths, that is what remains, and frankly, it is more powerful than any myth. The real story is already devastating enough, and maybe that is the haunting thought this tragedy leaves us with. Football can make a city dream, yes, but when the dream is torn apart, the same game can reveal who we are when winning no longer matters. It can expose negligence. It can expose tenderness. It can expose whether rivalry was ever really the deepest truth. Chapecoense answered that question with its suffering. Medellín answered it with flowers. Chapecó answered it with rain, open doors, and green shirts held like prayer. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.